What an appropriate song. What a wonderful thought. And how it's so needed today. The message of love and mercy and the message of using our lives and our hearts and bodies and opportunities to glorify God and to worship Him. Very grateful for everyone's presence tonight. Very encouraged by your devotion to the Lord that's brought you back out. I came across a quote that I'm considering the quote of the week, and I wonder if you can agree with it. It says, "For plundering and violence are before me, there is strife and contention arises, therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth." That seems to be about a pretty good commentary and analysis of things in our society right now, that there's plundering and violence. I think we have seen evidence of that. There's strife and contention. The law has been stripped. It's powerless in some sense. It is limited. And of course, justice is not prevailing at the moment. And like I said, that would be a profound commentary on our society, but it was written 600 years before Christ lived. And it was stated by Habakkuk. And Habakkuk was looking at the condition of Judah, and he was observing his brethren, and he was observing what was happening in their lives and had been happening for some time. And he's wondering why God is allowing these things to happen. He's wondering why God is allowing evil to prevail. And it's an exchange, Habakkuk is, this book, between God and the prophet. And it's happening, of course, right before Babylon is going to invade Judah and take the people in 3 stages off to Babylonian captivity. The Chaldeans were gaining power at this time. They defeated the Assyrian Empire in 612. And by 605, 606, they're going to take the first group of the people of Judah away from their land. And so in that little period of time between the rise of the Babylonians and the first deportation of the Jews, you have Habakkuk, who is making these observations, and he's having this exchange with God. And I thought it would be good for us to consider what he's saying, because he starts out by asking, "Lord, how long shall I cry?" in verse 2, "and you will not hear." So here's a man who's struggling. Here's a man who's trying to put things together in his own mind, and he's petitioning God for help in responding to the trouble of his time. And I just think it's so parallel and so relevant even in our time. And I just love God and His Word, because it's truly appropriate for any generation to study the Word of God. But he makes a couple of observations in this book that I think can really help us in understanding, number one, that God is aware of the wickedness. He could see what was happening with His people, and there was no reason for Habakkuk to fret over this or to worry if God saw this. And that's what it starts out in Habakkuk chapter 1, where he's asking in verses 2 through 4, "O Lord, how long shall I cry and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence and you will not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me, there is strife and contention arises, therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds." When I read that, it reminded me a lot of Lot, that righteous man whose soul was vexed by the things he saw from the wicked people around him day after day. But Lot was dealing with the people of Sodom when his soul was vexed. He was a righteous man who was in turmoil over the ungodly people around him, the people of the world. But Habakkuk was surrounded by the people who were supposed to be of God. He was surrounded by people who were the people of the kingdom of Judah. These were supposed to be faithful people to the Lord, but we know that they were caught up in idolatry, and they would eventually be judged for that. But he's saying, why do you show me this? It hurts me to see this. It hurts me to see the wickedness that is prevailing. And God responds to Habakkuk by saying in verse 5 of chapter 1, "I'll take care of that." He says in verse 5, "Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs." And so God's telling this man, look, I'm going to take care of this, and you won't believe how I'm about to take care of it. I'm going to use this nation that is swiftly on the rise. And they had just conquered the most dominant nation in the world, Assyrian Empire, and they did it rather swiftly. And so they are just progressing throughout the world. They're conquering everything. And he's saying, I'm going to use these people, God said. I'm going to use these people to judge my people. And we see that's exactly what would happen, that the people of Judah would eventually be removed from their land like the people of Israel were in the Assyrian captivity. And so the people of Judah would be taken into Babylonian captivity. And that would happen, of course, even in the days of Habakkuk. And these people who did this were some violent people. The Chaldeans were vicious people. They were threatening people. They were just terrorizing the world. That's what God says in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 7. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle hastens to eat. In verse 9 of Habakkuk 1, they all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So these were people who were not, these were not good people. These were some wicked people. And yet God is saying, I'm going to use these people to take care of the wickedness that is vexing you, the wickedness that you see among your brethren. And that's what happened. I mean, God did. And like I said, Habakkuk came in right at the end of the reign of Judah. That you had, for the most part, in Judah, you had some godly kings reigning. But toward the end, most of the time they were wicked people. You had a couple who stood out. Hezekiah was righteous. Josiah was righteous. But after that, you're dealing with some ungodly kings. And the last one to reign before Nebuchadnezzar came in and took these people away was Jehoiakim. And that's when Habakkuk was, of course, doing his work and making this observation with God. And it says in 2 Chronicles 36 that this man was an evil man. He did evil in the sight of God. And the person who would eventually replace him was evil. So there was a series of kings who were ungodly, leading the people away from God. And that's what set the tempo throughout the land. And so God was going to judge these people for abandoning him. And he didn't need to worry about that. God saw it, and he would judge the people for their sins. But that led Habakkuk to another question. And that, of course, was how God could use this evil people. But before that, of course, God is letting him know that he is fully aware. You know, men sometimes assume that with all the evil that's happening in the world or in our immediate environment, we might wonder, does God see this? How come he's letting this injustice prevail? What about it, God? Why are you letting things happen the way you do, even in this world? And it's, of course, a lesson that every generation has to learn, that God knows. There's nothing you and I can do that God doesn't see. And there's nothing you and I can do that we are not accountable to our God for. And over throughout the Word of God, he reminds people of this, even though they may think he does not see this. In Psalm 94, you have this great revelation given, where he says in verse 1, O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongs, O God, to whom vengeance belongs, shine forth. In verse 3, Lord, how long will the wicked triumph? They utter speech and speak insolent things, and all the workers of iniquity boast in themselves. They break in pieces your people, O Lord, and afflict your heritage. They slay the widow and the stranger and murder the fatherless. Yet they say, the Lord does not see, nor does the God of Jacob understand. And that's still true today. God doesn't see any. God's not doing anything. God's not going to do anything, is the thinking when it comes to wickedness and evil prevailing. And yet even in this context of Psalm 94, it goes on to say in verse 8 that, understand, you senseless among the people, and you fools, when will you be wise? He who planted the ear, shall he not hear? He who formed the eye, shall he not see? That's a great thought. You know, the person who invented the ear, the ability for you and I to perceive and to comprehend and to hear certain things, and then, of course, to see. God invented vision. He invented. The ear is from God. The eye is from God. He created all these things, these abilities. And yet he's saying here in Psalm 94, can the person who invented this stuff, can he not hear? And can he not see? Can he not be aware of all that's happening in this world? Of course he is. We understand the implication. It says in verse 10, he who instructs the nation, shall he not correct? He who teaches man knowledge. The Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are futile. God has seen this many, many, many times over. Now listen, if God was just the God of our generation for the first time, maybe we could possibly understand the thought, is God competent enough to deal with us? Maybe we could entertain that thought. Is he able to deal with us, seeing how he's new at this? You know how many people God has seen? You know how many people who have come into this world and who have left, who have lived life just like you and I are living it? That they had their same temptations, they had their same concerns, they had their same fears, they had their same obstacles, they had their same discoveries, they had the same enlightenment, all the same stuff. Billions upon billions of people have occupied this planet. We're at the end of a long line of people who have been through here. And there is not a thing you can experience that hasn't been done before. There is truly nothing new under the sun. You think you're the first person to worry about the future? The first person to fear the unknown? The first person to struggle with providing for your family? The first person to overcome weakness? You're not the first. We're at the long end of a line of people who have done this before. And behind it all, the person who invented vision sees it all. He sees it all. God has seen everything. There is nothing you and I can do. There is no decision we can make, no activity we can engage in that he has not seen before. And he's seen it many times over. And there is no sin you and I can commit that he has not seen, that he hasn't forgiven before. God is a God who is very well aware of our plight as people. He knows us. He's very aware of what we are thinking and what we are engaging in. And so Habakkuk needed to be reminded of that. And God did that. I can see, I know what's happening, Habakkuk, and I'm about to take care of it. I'm about to judge my people for their sin. But then that leads to a second major conflict that Habakkuk has in this exchange with God. Because if the first one wasn't enough, now he's saying, okay, now you're going to use the Chaldeans to judge your people. You realize that the Chaldeans are worse than your people? They don't even acknowledge you. They accredit their power to their gods. And you're going to use this nation to judge your people? And that is, of course, the dilemma he was up against. In Habakkuk chapter 1, and even when he expressed this concern, he knew he was going to be corrected by God, but he just couldn't put it all together. He couldn't see how God would use a wicked nation to judge his people. And it says in Habakkuk chapter 1, in verses 9 through 11, as he's talking about this, that they all come for violence. And again in verse 11, they ascribe this power, the Chaldeans do. They ascribe their power, their success, their swift rise to power. They're saying that their gods did it for them, even though God was doing it for them. In verse 12, it says, in verse 12, chapter 1, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them. for judgment. O rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? So how can you do this, God? How can you use a godless, wicked nation to judge your people and have this dominance over your people? And what God shows through this man is that God is so powerful that he is able to use mankind to accomplish his will. And he is able to use our character, our abilities and our choices. He can use them to carry out his will. When Babylon was dominating the world, the only reason they did that was because God gave them that ability. In fact, God said through Jeremiah that Nebuchadnezzar, who was a godless man, I mean, here's the man who expected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow down to him when the horns played, that he wanted worship and praise of this great image because he said so. This is Nebuchadnezzar, a godless man. And yet God said over and over, especially through Jeremiah, that Nebuchadnezzar is my servant. In chapter 27 of Jeremiah, he says in verse 6, I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. And the beast of the field I have also given him to serve him. And it goes on to say in verse 8, any nation that does not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to punish them, is what God said through Jeremiah. So Nebuchadnezzar, this wicked person, was being used by God. He was being used by God to carry out his will. And that's the observation he's making with Habakkuk. And that's the dilemma, of course, this prophet has. But God's saying he could do that. And he can do that. And he can still do that. He can still use our character to carry out his will and even the acts of judgment. You know, it's like a coach. A coach can take certain players and their skill set and position them in such a way to get, hopefully, the outcome he wants or she wants throughout the game. Well, God's the same way. He can take our character, our ability, our resources, who we are, and use us, use any person to carry out his will, even that of carrying out the act of judgment. He could do that. Now, in making that observation, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, you may wonder at some point, well, what about now? Is God using the wicked people of our society to judge our nation? Because you have a lot of chaos, you have a lot of wickedness prevailing, you have a lot of people who are defying the law, who are defying God, who are defying righteousness, and they are crippling this nation. Is God doing that? Is God using the wicked people of this world to judge this nation? I don't know. But part of me asks the question, do we deserve it? Do we as a nation deserve to be judged for all the things that we've endorsed as a nation? From the slaughtering of innocent people for decades, we've killed millions of people through the act of abortion. Do we not deserve something for that? That we as a nation as a whole have endorsed the transition of the traditional family to that of supporting same-sex, and that this is something that is tolerated by our nation as a whole. Do we not deserve judgment for that? Sodom was judged for that very thing. They were judged. Sodom and Gomorrah. Do we not deserve it? Now, I don't want it. Obviously, I don't want judgment from God, and we are going to pray that righteousness might prevail. But is he capable of using violent people to judge this nation? Is he capable of doing that? It's certainly within his abilities, and we can see that. And frankly, it's not done yet. The transitions that are happening in this nation, especially with the agenda to change the traditional family. You ought to look up one of the major organizations that is being endorsed by all the top sporting organizations in our nation. They're all supporting this one organization. And this one organization on their website makes it very clear that their agenda is to dismantle the traditional family and promote transgender families and homosexual families. And all these major sporting organizations are supporting this organization. And I'll let you look it up yourself. I don't want to get political. But with things like that, do we not deserve judgment? Part of me says we do, yet at the same time, I pray that righteousness might prevail. But see, that's within God's realm. He can act like that. He can operate like that. He can use wicked people to judge other people. And that's what he was doing. In Jeremiah chapter 51, in response to that, yes, he used Babylon, but see, here's the thing. That even though God will use wicked people to judge other people, he turns around and holds the wicked people accountable for what they did. That's what's so profound about our God. That even though he was telling people to bow to Nebuchadnezzar, later he turns and judges Babylon for their own wickedness and their own evil. In Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 26, he says, I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all the evil they have done in Zion in your sight, says the Lord. And the same thing was repeated in chapter 50, where he tells them over and over in chapter 50 of Jeremiah, put yourselves in array against Babylon all around, all you who bend the bow. Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Shout against her all around. She has given her hand, her foundations have fallen, her walls are thrown down. For it is the vengeance of the Lord. Take vengeance on her, as she has done, so do to her. And you can see this a lot in the prophets, where God would use a certain nation to judge other nations, and then turn around and judge that the perpetrators for their own wickedness. It's profound. It's profound to think about this aspect of God. But when you see all this happening, here's the point. That yes, God can use evil people to accomplish his will, but the point is this. The point is, we don't need to be one of those evil people. And that we need to be people who humble ourselves and trust him. And as it says in verse 4 of chapter 2, we need to be people of faith. Because here is a profound observation throughout the book of Habakkuk, where he says in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4, the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. And that's really the answer everybody needs to hear. That a person who believes in God, they're going to have faith. They're going to trust God. Even when things seem to be falling apart, we live by faith. Because we know, ultimately, God has the final say. He always has the final say, and he knows what he's doing. Again, if this was his first time, maybe we could question his abilities. He's done this a long time. And he's capable of doing it even longer. And so when I look at the scene of the world, yeah, I pray for righteousness to prevail. I pray for justice to prevail, for godliness to be restored. Yes, I do. But ultimately, if it's not done, I trust God. I know God. I know he will eventually win. And eventually, if it is within his will, he will restore certain things within this world. But if not, I trust him. He knows what he's doing. And so, in response to that, "O Lord, how long shall I cry?" said this prophet, in teaching all of us how we need to be people who trust God in troubling times. But the question is, how do you respond? Do you lose faith when you see all that's happening in the world? Do you lose faith, or do you live by faith? Do you trust him? Years ago, there was a man who tried to take his life by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think it's like since the 1930s, something like that, 2,000 people have done that. All of them died, except for 20 people. I mean, literally 1% of everybody who's attempted that, only 1% has survived. And he was one of the 20. And you need to look it up sometime. I mean, as far as his message overall, I think it's a tremendous message of teaching us not to do this. But what he said was that when he went over that side, when he actually cleared the rail to try and take his life, he said he knew in a millisecond that he had made a mistake, and he instantly regretted it. And he said that all the other 19 survivors, they all had that same message. They immediately regretted it when they jumped over the side. And fortunately, they survived. Had a lot of injuries as a result of it, but they survived. 99% of the other people did not. And he is a wonderful message of teaching us not to do something like that, because everybody who does regrets it. But not everybody comes back to tell about it. But I look at a story like that, and I look at a situation like that, and are we not tempted at times to think like that? That it's hopeless? There's just no hope in our circumstances in life, and that this is the only remedy for our mistakes, for our troubles, or whatever it might be. Listen, friends, the answer is found in Habakkuk. The answer is, the just shall live by faith. We trust God. It's not easy, and we may not always understand why things are happening the way they're happening, but I trust Him. I trust God. He knows what He's doing, and He can lead us through any obstacle if we are people who wait on the Lord. And so he goes on to say, the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. That's the very last verse of chapter 2. Trust Him. Trust our holy God. He is profound and He is wise. Well, if you're here and you're not a child of God, we hope that you will live by faith, and that you would be a person who puts your trust in Him by obeying His Son and being set free from sin. And in obeying this gospel, God promises to forgive you. He will. He loves you. But you have to be a person who is willing to humble yourself, put away that pride, put away those sins, confess your faith in Jesus, and then be immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins. And He will forgive you. He is a God who is ready to take you back. If you've done some things that need to be corrected in a public way, then humble yourself. God will forgive you. If it's of a private nature, humble yourself. God will forgive you. Come to our God and respond to Him as we stand and sing.